This time I'd like to introduce Steve Greger, and he will give us an overview of the district's flipped classrooms. Mr. Greger.
Good evening, everyone. We have with us tonight two of our technology integration specialists for the district, Liz Patel for middle school and Josh Hanlon to my right for high school. And they have created a presentation for you tonight on the role of technology in the classroom.
Great, thank you. Tough act to follow there. We'll try. But it's something I'm really passionate about. I've gotten the chance to speak about things a couple times, and the role of technology in the classroom is becoming increasingly important from not only our investment we're making, but the impact it can have on kids, the ability to differentiate and personalize learning, and which I said from a personal experience, I think it's something that I would have really benefited from as a student when I was in high school. And we'll talk a little bit today about how classrooms are different than when I was in high school as well. But I always wanted to start out with kind of one of my favorite pictures. And when you look at this picture, this is a technology-rich classroom. I mean, there's no denying that. You have a classroom with technology in it. But until we change other things in the classroom, what's really the investment that we're getting out of technology? And if you're a board member, a taxpayer, someone in the community, you think about what's the return on investment? What's the ROI that we're getting when we put technology in the classroom? And that's something that's kind of hard to quantify because test scores aren't going to go up. I mean, there's no evidence of that. Is a kid going to come back and maybe donate a lot of money to the public school system? Maybe one or a few may. I don't know how often that happens. But it's kind of a shift in how we think. Instead of a return on investment, what's the return on education that we can get when we put devices in kids' hands in the classroom? And that's kind of what we want to talk about today. So first I want to just kind of get to some words, but kind of just some of the terminology that we'll talk about to help people have a better understanding, because I really think that just educating people in the community about effective use of the technology in the classroom is really important. And we saw the technology-rich classroom, but when we start really infusing technology and changing teaching practices, we get to this concept of blended learning. And if you look at a couple things up there that highlights, in the beginning, it's blended learning is students having actual control over the pace, the path at which they learn. The second bullet there, they're in a brick and mortar and they can break down those traditional walls of the classroom and access their learning outside of the classroom. And then finally, an integrated learning experience. And what that means is whether the student's learning online or from the teacher, the learning flows and it's not redundant, however that student's receiving their instruction. So blended learning takes all different types of forms, but to get into the meat and potatoes of kind of what we're talking about is the most popular model is flipped learning. And there's kind of a lot of myths to maybe what flipped learning is. Maybe it's kids just watch videos and they watch videos at home and they come in and maybe the teacher just gives them assignments in class. But that's really not what flipped learning is about. And kind of the overarching theme that you'll hear about today is flipped learning is how we use time and how we use space. And that's what flipped learning is. And it's taking the time that we have together and how can we make that more meaningful? Is it meaningful for a teacher to stand up and lecture to a group of students when in the group space, when they could get that in the individual space? When in the group space, they could be doing things that are going to make them more future ready, kind of that portrait of the graduate that we want. And Liz is going to touch on that a little bit more, but it's these skills that we want to get out of students when we're talking about flipped learning. We want them to be better communicators, be able to collaborate, be able to think critically, and be able to be more creative. And we want to be able to use the class time to accomplish that. We don't want to use that class time for direct instruction, for lecture. And that's what flipped learning really allows us to get to. And it really comes down to having students being more in control of their learning and be more self-directed. And you'll see that Liz is going to touch on a little bit of that as well. So this is a really good quote, and I like this quote for a couple reasons. Like I said before, school's a lot different now than when I went to school. And if you look at a job description from an accountant in 1980, 1990, and the job description of an accountant in 2018, it's going to be a lot different. Just like the classroom's a lot different. And sometimes that change is uncomfortable for not just teachers, but for students as well. Because if you think about when I went to school or you went to school, it was, here are the notes, here's the information, you need to know this, this, and that, and this is what's going to be on the test. But but it's a little bit different now. Now the teacher is able to pose a question to students, provide them with the resources and say, here's the question, I need you to find the answer, and I'm going to be able to guide you along that way. And that's a really difficult challenge for students, and it's a really tough shift in the classroom. And we have a lot of teachers, and Dr. Greger will touch about that a little bit later. They're doing a great job with that. So I'm going to turn it over to Liz. She'll give you a little bit more. I said that whole concept of time and space. Liz is going to speak about that a little bit more.
We're going to talk a lot about the differences between whole group, traditional direct instruction, and a flipped learning environment. But before we do that, I want to take a step back and think about where whole group direct instruction really came from and why it's been so popular over the years. And it has to do with, over time, there was a lack of resources. If we look back into early educational systems, there was no other way to do it. Everyone was forced to learn at the same pace using the same materials. But today, classrooms are different. We have all sorts of resources, technology, options, and that allows us to differentiate our instruction to meet kids where we're at and help them grow to achieve those skills that Josh was talking about. So these technology resources help us change, and we hit on this earlier, time and space. And there's two big spaces we talk about when we're talking about flipped instruction. The group space, which is when all of the kids are together in the classroom and the teacher is with them. And the individual space is when students, have control over their time, the pacing, the activities, okay? And that individual space doesn't mean it's at home. It means it's on their own in school, or it could be at home, okay? So those are the two big spaces we talk about and we compare. So looking at the individual space and comparing it between the traditional and the flipped classroom, I went too far, I apologize. Looking at the group space, but we're looking at the traditional and flipped classroom. In the group space, in the traditional classroom, students are technically usually doing one of these types of activities, taking notes, listening to lectures, doing a reading, watching a video, having whole class discussions. And during that time, the teacher is there to lead that and push students through it. Students, after that time is over, are then able to independently apply that information with assistance from the teacher or checks from the teacher. But in the flipped classroom, students are working at their own pace when they're using all of those videos, readings, resources, and more. Sometimes in small groups, okay, sometimes individually. And the teachers can push in and work with large groups, small groups, or individuals while students are working at their own pace with those resources. And the teachers are able to help guide the discussion and help kids really get the learning going. All right, and it gives the kids opportunity to work collaboratively. And that's really important because the group space should be used by the group to work together and to achieve the resources and to be resources to each other. So that's kind of where the shift comes in. We don't have to use group space time to just convey information. That can shift more now into the individual space. So in a flipped classroom, students can access all that time on their own, listening to lectures, watching short videos, doing readings at their own pace. Whereas in a traditional classroom, the individual pace would have been for trying to apply the information independently. Okay, and that can sometimes lead to a lot of frustration because they don't have the supports that you would have in the group space. So it's a whole new way of doing things, and that's where the term flipped actually comes from. We're kind of flipping it over. Looking at two different classroom scenarios, if we're looking at a traditional classroom, you might see something like this one day, where a teacher's up front lecturing, kind of like I am right now, and everyone's taking notes. We have a snapshot of 5 students. Student A, they are really confused. They've tried to ask questions. They're just falling further and further behind. While at the same time, student B, she's got all this, she's bored, she's done. Okay, she didn't have to pay attention at all. Meanwhile, the other students, C through E, are right on target. We're teaching in the whole class traditional scenario, we're teaching at the middle, usually. So those kids are right on task. But you can see we have some students that we're not meeting their needs at all the times because we have to do the same for all. But in the flipped classroom scenario, kids could be at different stations in a station model. Okay, student A who was struggling could be working with a teacher in a small group, getting some assistance, while student B is independently watching videos and doing some follow-up simulations, while C and E students are kind of working together on a collaborative project. Meanwhile, this is just a sample, and of course the teacher would rotate through and different things could happen, but there's flexibility and there's support. One of the things we hear a lot about is that some students feel a little uncomfortable with this model, and as educators, we should be happy about that. Okay, because that's when real growth happens, is when people get uncomfortable. Brains change and things move along when we struggle or we grapple with concepts or ideas. So we like this quote: you have to learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable if you want to change, if you want to grow. And so the question is, well, why is it so uncomfortable for students? Because we're not preparing students for the factory-based model of learning. Modern day educators, as we saw in that Steve Jobs slide, we're not preparing them to work in factories. We're preparing them to be thinkers, to address those 4 skills that Josh talked about. So because of that, the teacher has to stop thinking about what they have to do to get the information across to the students. They have to think about what they're going to do, what kind of work and planning and activities they're going to prepare to have the kids work harder inside of the classroom. Okay, so the teacher's role is to help guide and support as the students work, but the heavy lifting inside of the classroom is done by the students. Well, the teachers then have to do a lot of work prepping on the outside to make that happen. So because of this, we've had to do a lot of help and a lot of work to get teachers to that point where they can implement this. Dr. Greger, would you like to talk about STAMR a little bit?
Thank you, Liz. So how have we ensured that our staff are infusing these techniques effectively in the classroom? So a few years ago, we adopted this SAMR model, and through, as of today, about 555 learning walks since the 3rd week of September have been conducted in levels 6 to 12. So we're gathering a lot of data that are in direct alignment with our district goals and strategic plan. So in simple terms, I chose this graphic. There are many, many depictions of this. Substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. And clearly, if you had a choice, if you're a coffee drinker, which one would you want? Okay, so you might go for the pumpkin spice, which is the R. So here's a better, maybe a simpler, more concrete way to describe what we're looking for. So if you take a simple task like using an atlas, which is a traditional material, and you had a technology as an option, what would you do with that? Well, on the substitution level, which is very basic, you would simply be looking at the Google Earth app instead of looking at a paper atlas. Probably very little change in learning, although some students may be more motivated by Google Earth. The augmentation level, which is still only enhancing the learning activity, we would then add a feature or two that the atlas would not provide. So Google Earth, you could actually measure distances on, between 2 geographic locations, as opposed to taking out a ruler and trying to figure that out in scale and all that. So then you see a line of demarcation where we're moving up to the transformation level, which means that we're totally changing the learning activity. And at the M stage, modification, we would then make a more important task redesign. And in this case, for Google Earth, we might be able to add layers to a map. Here's a political map with cities. Let's put a layer and find out where the railroads are. There's a relationship, okay? And you can keep doing that, and you can start to make spatial interactions and all kinds of conclusions an atlas would not tell you. Finally, at the highest level of transformation is called redefinition, and this enables the student to do something that would be completely impossible without the technology. So in this case, using Google Earth, they might create a guided tour with a narration and share it online and get feedback from someone else in a completely different region of the country or the world, a different classroom altogether. So we're looking at this as a way to measure how effective is the use of technology in the classroom, not by the teacher, but by the student. All of these things are student-centered activities that we're looking to measure. So I'll leave you with this quote. I like this author. Fullen said, pedagogy is the driver. And Liz alluded to it, Josh alluded to it. We need to have sound pedagogical procedures, instructional procedures, but the technology is the accelerator of the learning. Thank you very much.